Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Author biography. This is mostly from Wikipedia, but with some info and all quotes from a biographer named Neil Wyatt. Kate Chopin was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1850. After her father was killed in a train accident when she was 5.5, she lived with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, all widows, all, quote, smart, independent, single women from a long line of groundbreaking women, end quote. Her great-great-grandmother was, quote, the first woman in St. Louis to obtain legal separation from her husband, end quote. Although having been educated in a Catholic school, Chopin developed a strong skepticism for religion, and Wyatt notes that she was a popular, if cynical, debutante, end quote, who learned to smoke when she was around 19 years old. Obviously not typical for the time period. She married at the age of 20 in 1870 and moved to New Orleans, but when her husband's business failed, moved to the small town of Clouterville, Louisiana, where she bore 7 children before she was 28. After her husband died of malaria, she moved back to St. Louis and began writing to support herself. She wrote stories about the people she had known in Louisiana and became widely known and successful as a local color writer. Local color stories being those that use the dialect and setting of a region. Many of her stories were published in national magazines and were collected into 2 published volumes before the publication of her novel, The Awakening, inspired by the true story of a New Orleans woman. However, the American reading public wasn't ready for the content and message of the novel, which drew such negative criticism that she wrote only a few more short stories in the remainder of her life. Chopin died of a cerebral hemorrhage on August 22, 1904, at the age of 54. The Story of an Hour was originally published in Vogue magazine under the title The Dream of an Hour in 1894. The story contains little of the local color elements many of Chopin's other stories hold. A little bit of socio-historical background. In the 19th century, women were expected to marry, have children, and maintain the household, doing the cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children. Even when a family was wealthy enough to afford servants, a woman was not free to pursue her own interests. Married women in the United States were legally subordinate to their husbands, and wives could not own their own property, keep their own wages, or enter into contracts. Marriage was viewed as a way to encourage social stability and moral behavior, and it allowed secure transfer of property within a family. Marriages were still often arranged, though the idea of marrying for love, a trend that began in America during the 18th century, was becoming more common. The story. There we go. And you are seeing a slightly annotated version. I didn't mark everything. This is kind of where I started at. And some of what I noted here, I later found out to be wrong. Okay. There's a little parenthetical note at the end of the first paragraph, for instance, says name, mallard, a male duck. That is not correct. A mallard is a type of duck not male. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute. The story has essentially 4 characters, but there's a fifth pseudo character that comes in right at the very end. Mrs. Mallard, who goes without a first name at the beginning of the story, but we later find that out to be Louise, is the protagonist or main story of the character. The antagonist, which is a character which often drives a change in the protagonist or forces a specific action, is unclear in this story, and in fact might be again Mrs. Mallard, because the conflict here is mostly internal. Right. It is possible that one character can be both the protagonist and antagonist. And I'm not really quite willing to go out on a limb with Story of an Hour and say that's the case, but it is possible. And the conflict in the story is primarily internal to the character of Mrs. Mallard. A character, Brentley Mallard, her husband, is what we would refer to as a secondary character. And by the way, Mrs. Mallard is what we would also call a round character, a character whom we learn enough about to conceive of as a real person. Brentley Mallard, as with all the other characters in the story, are what we refer to as flat characters. We only learn 1 or 2 things about them, and they usually only appear in a story for to initiate 1 or 2 actions, right? They have very limited purpose in a story. So Brentley Mallard, a second character. Then there is Richards, a family friend, also a flat secondary character. Josephine, Mrs. Mallard's sister, also a flat secondary character. And that pseudo character at the very end is actually, I guess, multiple persons, referred to only as the doctors. Okay. The story is told from a limited, omniscient, third-person point of view. A limited, omniscient narrator has the ability to move through time and space and see into the minds of characters. That's an omniscient narrator. A limited, omniscient narrator sees into the mind of usually just one character, sometimes in a longer work like a novel, maybe can see into the minds of 2 characters. But in this case, we have 1 character, maybe 2. We sort of see into the mind of Richards for just a second. The plot is, as the title suggests, it is the story of an hour. The title itself suggests a chronology, and mostly that is true, except the story actually begins what is referred to as in medias res, and that's a Latin phrase that just means in the middle of things. And stories frequently do this because, face it, the beginnings of some stories isn't real exciting. So we start at a point where there's some tension or conflict, and then, as in this story, a flashback is revealed is used to reveal exposition or background material. Then the story does, in fact, fall into a linear chronology. It moves through time as we typically experience it. All right. So I'm not going to read the entire story out loud. Instead, I'm just going to read some parts of it and talk about what's going on in those parts. And I want to talk specifically in this story about the plot device foreshadowing, about symbols, about irony as it appears in literature, and then hopefully a little bit about theme, if I don't run out of time, because I today have my stopwatch running and I see I'm already at 9 minutes. Okay, so the very first paragraph. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So in this paragraph, we have the protagonist, Mrs. Mallard, is introduced. We are told that she has a heart trouble, which is ambiguous, right? She has heart trouble. We assume this to be a medical condition, but we will find out later in the story that it's also a matter of emotional conflict, right? And that, in a way, is foreshadowing both of what is going to transpire inside the character of Mrs. Mallard's head and to the end of the story. And we are told that great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. And it is, in fact, the husband, Brentley Mallard's death, that we find to be the initiating event in this story. It is the thing that prompts what unfolds before us. Then we're told in the next paragraph, it was her sister Josephine who told her in unbroken sentences, veiled hints that revealed and half concealing. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. Hey, I have my suspicions about Richards. Then we enter into a flashback. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. Okay. And again, we've got our initiating action. We've been taken back in time and place to a newspaper office. Apparently, this is where Richards worked at, or I can't imagine why else he would just be there. But upon learning the news, he rushes to the home. Mrs. Mallard's sister Josephine is either already there or was promptly notified. And notice too that Richards assures himself of the truth by a second telegram. If we didn't know the time of the story as being 1894, because we've been told that up at the top, then this would be one of those clues that would let us know that this is set quite a ways back in time, right? People simply don't communicate by telegraph today. Indeed, if I remember correctly, the telephone was invented in 1903. God, I hope I got that right. Let me do it. Let me do a real quick search in another window here. Because I should have looked that one up beforehand, but I'm sorry. Invention of telephone. Oh, the first Bell telephone, 1875. All right, but they undoubted. The invention of the car was 1903, but the invention of the telephone, 1875, undoubtedly did not come into much public use until later, right? Actually, when we take a look at trifles, we'll talk about something called a party line, and I'll talk about that when we get there. But telephones, took a while for them to catch on, like most other modes of communication in our world, or at least in the old world. Everything moved a little bit slower back then. All right, so a telegram. So we have some essence of setting. Again, I don't want to get too labored down. There are, in fact, two situations in this story that one could label as foreshadowing. The first is the heart trouble. Later in the story, we are told that, I'm on the wrong page, and I'm looking for it here real fast. Okay, in this paragraph over here on the second page, it said she was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. And this is where some of the tension in the story is really starting to build. The conflict is becoming obvious, the tension is building, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. Now, of course, foreshadowing is one of those weird things that you don't recognize until you've gotten to the end and you see how things might relate to that. And I don't want to blow the end of the story just yet, but keep in mind those white hands as we move forward. Okay, another thing that happens a lot in this story, like poems, stories can use metaphor, simile, other kinds of figurative language, and in fact they do. And a couple of examples of that, at least let's start with an example of this, a metaphor. Okay, in this paragraph here, the third paragraph, it says the storm of grief. And this is in fact an explicit metaphor. We have both the object, the thing itself, and the image, the modifier. In this case, grief is the object and the image is a storm that modifies how we view that image. So we have an explicit metaphor. In the next paragraph, we have an implied metaphor. She sank, pressed down by physical exhaustion into a chair, right? A roomy armchair, we're told. She sank. What sinks? Boats, right? Now, this is an implied metaphor because we don't actually get the boat in the comparison. We just have the verb sank. But boats, when they sink into the ocean, which is itself a symbol, a conventional symbol, right? One that brings its meaning to us from culture. The ocean is a conventional symbol of journeys and of the unknown. So she sinks into a journey into the unknown. And that becomes very, very important as we move along. So an implied metaphor. Then symbols. And what paragraph should I look at? Because there are symbols all over the place in this story. Let's take this next paragraph, the fifth one. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. Stop there. Okay. New spring life. The seasons all have conventional symbology. Spring is associated with birth, rapid growth, right? Summer is more about maturation, growing older. And then fall is, of course, harvest. If we're talking about it in terms of life, these would be the quote golden years, when we're actually starting to decay. And winter represents symbolically death, right? So the seasons are those things. And of course, we have the trees, and trees are green, and green itself has a lot of symbology associated with growth and life. Okay, so that's the first sentence. Then we have the delicious breath of rain was in the air. Again, we have a breath of rain, a metaphor. Breath, of course, when you're breathing, you're alive. So a little bit of sort of implied symbology there. And rain, again, another thing that has a long history of symbolism. Rain is associated both with sadness because of the association with tears. To quote the Stevie Ray Vaughan song, the sky is crying, right? But also rain is associated with cleansing. So both of those things seem applicable in this story, and I hope you had a chance to read it before you're watching this as requested. All right, what else is in here? Oh, the distant song. Could this be a symbol of happiness? Because people sing when they're happy, right? And then finally, the sparrows. And no, I didn't read those last couple sentences because I see I'm running short on time. Sparrows, birds in general, are representative of freedom because they are free to move about the sky, which is also representative of freedom, unhindered, unlike people who are bound to the earth. So birds are conventional symbols of freedom. And of course, specific kinds of birds have specific sub-symbolism. And of course, sparrows are songbirds. So freedom and happiness in this case. All right. Again, I don't have time to pursue any more of the symbols, but there are a ton of them. All right. So we're going to jump to the end of the story, which is down here on page 3. So Louise has been up in her room and she has had this revelation. She has found in her husband's death not grief, but happiness, in a newfound sense of freedom. She had been feeling somehow trapped in this marriage. And we don't know if it was arranged. We don't know if it was a marriage of convenience and wealth and riches. And of course, historically, before about the 17th century, 18th century, apparently in the United States, people married for wealth and money, for wealth and power, excuse me. And we don't know why this marriage was adopted, but she apparently felt very trapped in it. In fact, it is not until after this line, free, free, body and soul, free, Mrs. Mallard kept whispering. And then her sister comes to check on her and she says, Louise, open the door. This is the first time we hear Mrs. Mallard's first name after she has had this epiphany of freedom, right? Okay, so we get to the end and she has emerged from her room and it says someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. So here's our first instance of irony. We have what's called situational irony. There are 4 types of irony in literature: situational, verbal, which is where someone says something but means something else; dramatic, which is where the audience knows something the characters don't; and then cosmic, which is where fate, God, etc., steps in and stomps someone's hopes and aspirations into the ground. So Brentley Mallard shows up. Now, we've been led to believe he's been dead this whole time, and all of a sudden, here he is. So this is situational irony. We continue. Josephine let out a piercing cry, and Richards tried to block the view of Brentley from his wife, but he was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. And that is the end of the story. Now, the doctors are not being verbally ironic. They mean what they say. This is dramatic irony. This is where the reader knows something that the characters don't. We have, through the limited omniscient narrator, seen into Louise Mallard's mind, and we know that she wasn't grieving over her husband's death, that she was actually felt release due to his death. There is also here the potential, of course, for that cosmic irony when fate steps in and crushes a character's hopes and dreams. So at the very end of this story, in the last, 3 paragraphs, we get situational irony, dramatic irony, and probably cosmic irony too. Which leaves me a very brief amount of time, like a minute and 15 seconds, to talk about theme. And again, what we have here is a character who has been trapped in a potentially unfulfilling relationship. It says that Brentley always looked upon her with love, and she knew she'd cry again when she saw his folded hands in death. So it's not that it was completely loveless. It's just that Louise wanted more for herself, and she was felt trapped. And sometimes, when a person is trapped in an unfulfilling relationship, they can want out so badly that the death of a spouse seems like a good thing. And when that doesn't happen, either figuratively or literally, then sometimes, um, you know, uh, the person who feels trapped is the one who dies, literally or figuratively. And that's where I meant the literally or figuratively to tone in. And I am out of time. We are at 24 minutes and 55 seconds. Have a good day.